Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's really nice to see all of you. My name is Alan Dettlaff, and I'm very honored to serve as Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work here at the University of Houston. And I'm very pleased today to welcome all of you to the 7th annual Maconda Brown O'Connor Distinguished Lecture, Speaking of Social Justice, featuring Dorothy Roberts, author of Torn Apart, this year's selection for our Social Justice Summer Reading Program. One of my favorite things to do every year is to select the book for this program that we invite all of our GCSW students, faculty, and staff to read over the summer. And the books that I choose for this series reflect our commitment to racial justice and our commitment to fighting against racism and white supremacy. Over the last several years, these books have become particularly important for us because of the unique place where social work is as a profession. Social work is really at a critical turning point in our history, a point where we have to have some very honest discussions and make some very important decisions about who we are and what we want to be as a profession. In many ways, this began during the summer of 2020 following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others at the hands of the police. And among the many conversations that occurred during that time, there was a lot of conversation about the role of social work in policing. Many people were calling for social work to replace police in some situations as a means of reducing the racist violence that we were seeing from policing. And those conversations led many of us in the profession to acknowledge that replacing the police with social workers really isn't a solution to anything. Because replacing the police with social workers doesn't mean that we won't continue to see racist outcomes. And that's because social work has its own very complicated history with racism that is deeply ingrained in the origins of our profession. And to this day, we continue to see racism and racist outcomes in the systems where we as social workers practice. And this is because, with few exceptions, social work as a profession hasn't done a very good job of acknowledging the history of racism in our profession and the problem of racism that still exists. To this day, social work as a profession continues to debate whether we should collaborate with the police, whether we should work in jails and prisons, and whether we should be part of crisis response teams that walk hand in hand into Black and Brown communities with the very people who are responsible for murdering and terrorizing them. Social work is also deeply ingrained in what many people refer to as the child welfare system, but as you'll hear tonight, is more accurately known as the family policing system, a system that disproportionately surveils, polices, and separates Black children from their parents, and then exposes those children to an intervention the system calls foster care that subjects them to immense harm and trauma. Can we as a profession continue to be complicit in the involuntary separation of children from their families, knowing the harm this produces? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves. Can we continue to be complicit in a system that causes harm and the inequities that result? Can we continue to support a system of policing that disproportionately surveils, polices, and punishes Black and brown bodies? Or can we begin to envision and work towards a society that responds to social problems without the need for surveillance, punishment, and family separation? That's what we hope to talk about tonight. Tonight's event is a continuation of a series of conversations we began 2 years ago, in which we explored abolition as a vision, abolition as practice, and abolition as a critical framework to bring about change, specifically as a framework to address the racist violence and racist outcomes that we see in our carceral systems, including the family policing system. But this year's reading selection is particularly important to me because of my personal connection to this work and to my admiration for the career of Dorothy Roberts and how that's inspired me. More than 20 years ago, I read Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare by Dorothy Roberts, just after leaving the Department of Family and Protective Services, where I had worked as a child welfare caseworker for many years. And reading this book was the first time I came to understand the harm that child welfare intervention causes to Black children, and understanding not just the harm that it causes, but my own complicity in perpetuating that harm. My complicity in removing children from their families significantly changed the course of my life and career, and I'll be forever grateful to Dr. Roberts for that. And for the journey that I've been on for this past 20 years, I can safely say that I would not be Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work if it weren't for Dr. Roberts, because that began my pursuit of justice in the child welfare system, which for many years I thought could be achieved through reform, but now I understand can only be achieved through abolition. And now, 20 years later, I'm very excited that all of our students, faculty, and staff had the opportunity to read Torn Apart, which underscores the harm and oppression the child welfare system causes to Black children, families, and communities. And tonight I'm very excited to welcome Dorothy Roberts to our campus. Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania, where she directs the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society. She's a contributor to the 1619 Project and the author of 4 books, including the best-selling Killing the Black Body. Her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent social issues in policing, family regulation, science, medicine, and bioethics. And she's been featured in countless media outlets, including the New York Times, MSNBC, NPR, CNN, ABC, and many others. And tonight she's here with us in Houston. Welcome, Dr. Roberts. I'm so excited to be sitting with you here tonight.
I'm excited to be here with you too, Alan. This is wonderful.
It really is. As I said, your career or your work has had such an influence on me. We've known each other for 20 years now, going back to our time when we both lived in Chicago. And your work really has had a huge inspiration on me. But I wanted to start tonight's discussion with just a little bit of background about the child welfare system and the family policing system, understanding that many of the people here tonight, many of the people watching at home may have assumptions about the child welfare system. Many people believe that the child welfare system is a helpful, benevolent system that is necessary in our society because of the way that it protects children. In your book, Torn Apart, however, your introductory chapter is called A Benevolent Terror. So can you explain to us how you see some families experience the child welfare system, what many of us refer now to as the family policing system, and why it's important to call it what it is, not child welfare, but family policing?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I think that the government for centuries has done a really effective job of a propaganda around the child welfare system. Even the names, child welfare, foster care, child protective services, imply that this is a system that protects children, that improves their welfare, and that cares for them. And I think most people who haven't experienced it, or people who work in the system and want to justify their role in the system, have this idea that it is a benevolent system, that it's a kind of social service program that both provides resources for families, but maybe more importantly, takes children away from families to save them from terrible parents, from monsters who are abusing them. And so there's this common idea that it is benevolent and, as you said, it's necessary, that we have to have a child welfare system, or else children will be gravely harmed in their homes, and it would be atrocious to leave them there. And so this is a part of our government that is saving them, and so we must support it. And that is a false idea, of a false description of what the system does. I like the way you asked the question. You said, how do families experience it? And so I'd like to answer your question in a couple ways: how families experience it, and also what is the purpose of this system if it's not to protect children. So I have spoken with a lot of families who have been impacted by the child welfare system over the course of 20 years, or more than that actually, maybe more like over the course of 30 years. My book Shattered Bonds was published 21 years ago, but I had been doing research in that field longer than that, and a big part of my work was meeting with mostly Black mothers in Chicago whose kids have been taken away from them. And I've also read a lot of accounts and have worked with now families who have been affected by the system. And I can tell you that all of them have expressed to me that they experience the system as harmful to their families. They experience it as an intervention that has disrupted their relationships with their children, and children who have been in the system, the ones I have spoken with, have talked about how it was worse than the problems that they had at home. They see it as a system that forcibly takes their children away. Many expressed it as a form of kidnapping, as a form of slavery, which, by the way, Malcolm X described it as a legal form of modern day slavery. And they have felt that they had to comply with the mandates of the system in order to keep their children or to get their children back, not because this was helpful to them, but it was the only way they could hold on to their families. And many have expressed how their children were worse off after being placed in foster care or because of the investigation. So my interactions with families who've been affected by the system is almost, universally, this is a system that disrupted our lives and made it harder for me to be a good parent, or made it harder for me to meet my children's needs. Or children saying, if I survived foster, it was not because of the system, it was because of other people, who helped me out or got me back with my family. So that's one way of looking at it. I think it's really important to pay attention to how people who are supposed to be so-called served by the system feel about it. I say in Torn Apart, it's kind of Orwellian to say we're serving people by forcing them, to engage in conduct and tasks that they don't think is helpful to them. That's not a service, right? But then another way of answering your question is to look politically and historically at how the child welfare system functions. And I call it a family policing system because it doesn't function to serve. It doesn't function to help. It doesn't function to support. It functions to accuse and investigate and supervise and regulate and punish. It functions to tear families apart. It functions to invade their privacy, even violating their constitutional rights. So, and also importantly, who does it enmesh in its so-called services? It's not an accident that, by and large, almost virtually all, there's some exceptions, but the vast majority of families entangled in the system are the most marginalized families. They're families that have been subordinated by hierarchies of race, class, gender, disability, citizenship status. Why is that? Why is it that it's not a system that serves wealthy families? Right? So that is also why it's just wrong to think of it as a service providing agency and to understand it as a policing arm of government.
Right. I think it's important that you mentioned that for many people, they view the system as a form of enslavement, and even Malcolm X called it that. And I think it's important to spend a couple minutes just to talk about the history of the system. Can you take us on a brief walk of some of the history that has played a part in rationalizing the idea of separating children from their parents, particularly Black children from their parents, going back to the era of human chattel slavery?
Yeah, I think to understand the foundation of this system and the ideology, the thinking behind it, you do have to go back to the institution of slavery and understand that family separation was essential to the slavery system. Under the institution of slavery, white enslavers were the heads of the plantation family, and they had total authority, legal authority and political authority over Black families. which meant that they could regulate the relationships between Black family members, including separating them at will. So from the moment that Black people were brought in chains to what's now the United States, they could be separated. Some of them were already separated from their families at that point, but continuing throughout the institution of slavery, families were separated at the auction block by judges who ordered that it was all right for different purchasers to buy family members separated from each other. And then even on farms and plantations, enslavers could sell away the children or sell away the mother or the father or any family member whenever it was economically advantageous, or to punish the family, or because they wanted to gift a family member. They could decide to a pregnant woman, your child, I'm going to gift your future child to a friend, and they could do that. So the moment the child is born, if they wanted to, that child could already be owned by someone else. And so the very institution of slavery included the idea that Black people should not have authority over their families. They should not have control over their families, that their families were in the control of white people. This is a fundamental aspect of white supremacy, and that continued after the Civil War in an aspect of the demolition of Reconstruction that we don't often hear about. I think we know more and more now that during the Reconstruction era, white supremacists took back power in the South with the Jim Crow system and eviscerated the Reconstruction amendments and ended Reconstruction, which was supposed to be, real emancipation of Black people and bringing them into democracy. And that never happened. And so I think now, largely because of the work of prison abolitionists, we're aware that incarceration became a means of virtually re-enslaving Black people. And there were Black codes that allowed police officers to pick up Black people just for being on the street and put them in prison, put them on chain gangs, lease them out to work for others. Now, that also happened with children through the apprenticeship system. And white people could petition, allege that Black parents were neglecting their children, and judges would use apprenticeship laws to make children the servants of, sometimes they're very former enslavers, but in the homes of white people, under the control of white people. And tens of thousands of Black children were virtually re-enslaved through the apprenticeship system, which is so much like what happens today with judges claiming that Black children are determining that Black children are being neglected and taking them from their parents and putting them in the custody of foster parents or into institutions, group homes and residential treatment facilities. And that's, I think, to me, where the formal child welfare system really begins in its relationship with Black families. I should also mention, it's important to note that at the same time, the US military was using child removal as a literal weapon of war against Native tribes. And this was a military tactic to take Native children away from their tribes and put them initially in military camps and then boarding schools. And that policy continued through the child welfare system into the 1970s until the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. We probably don't have time to go through all of this history, but we can look decade after decade, policy after policy, the way in which Black children were at first neglected by the formal child welfare system, other than this apprenticeship system, but they weren't receiving services in their homes. And as Black children began to be incorporated into the child welfare system, mostly as a result of civil rights activism, the system changed dramatically from primarily providing services to white families in their homes to removing Black children from their homes, so that foster care became the primary mode of so-called services to families, with now a huge foster care budget, huge foster care population. At one point, by 2000, Black children were the main group in foster care. And this, I think we can see as a backlash against the civil rights movement. So in every era, we could move on to the 1990s with the Adoption and Safe Families Act and the acceleration of removal of Black children and termination of parental rights, incentives to get children adopted rather than return them home to their families. These are policies that we can trace from the time of slavery to today that have been focused on disrupting Black families, not providing resources, not supporting families, and all based on the idea that Black children need to be saved from their families, not that their families should be supported by our ways of thinking, by the culture, by government, but instead this very destructive approach to Black families.
Right, right. I think it's really important that you mentioned that you can't separate what was happening in society at the same time that there was this really rapid rise in mandatory reporting laws. The shift from poverty relief to removing families all happened around the mid-60s during the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all of this racial turmoil in the country and fears of white people that Black people were gaining in power and status. And then all of a sudden the system shift drastically from supports to surveillance and separation.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is clearly a form of backlash by white supremacist thinking against the gains that Black people made, and the refusal by many white Americans to support any kind of service program that is going to support Black people. And so, we could see over and over when the welfare state is seen as being too beneficial to Black people, we see these images like the Black welfare queen who's supposed to be cheating white taxpayers and having babies just to get welfare, the neglectful Black mother, the absent Black father, these ideas that then turn policies that, we're too stingy. We've never had a strong welfare state in America, but policies that did provide some support for impoverished families now becoming basically behavior modification systems, punitive systems. And there was that period in the 60s. We can also then see the period in the 90s where we have the crime control bill, the welfare law that ended the federal entitlement to welfare, again, based largely on these images of Black mothers cheating the welfare state and having too many babies. And then the following year, that law was passed in 1996. 1997, you get the Adoption and Safe Families Act. That is the first time in US history that you had the mandate that states had to protect children by taking them from their homes without any mandate, federal mandate, that states had to support impoverished families. So you get the end of the federal entitlement to welfare in 1996, followed by the Adoption Safe Families Act saying, terminate the rights of the families that are struggling without adequate support, as a result of structures in our society that create poverty, and with Black people disproportionately bearing the burden of that. So the solution is, to this burgeoning foster care population, the solution was terminate parental rights faster, incentivize adoption, as opposed to support families, return these children to their homes.
Right.
And every one of these policies that makes the government stingier and more punitive brings in disproportionate numbers of Black families and is supported by these disparaging images of dysfunctional Black families that aren't capable of taking care of their children.
Right. You mentioned poverty. I want to talk about that for a minute. You write in Torn Apart, most allegations prompting a child welfare investigation are for neglect. The vast majority of the families subjected to investigation have low incomes or are living in poverty and could use help meeting their material needs. You also write about the costs of family policing, with about $30 billion a year spent on family separation. What would you want people to understand about how poverty leads to involvement in the system, and what could we be doing different with $30 billion?
Yes, that was a billion, by the way, yes. So there's so many ways in which I could address that question in terms of the relationship between poverty and family policing. So first of all, the child welfare system from its inception, even if we talk about how white children are treated in the system, as I said, for Black families, it was disrupt their families. They shouldn't have authority. Black parents should not have authority over their children. They need to be saved from their families. But the formal child welfare system that neglected Black children, that did not provide services at all, even that system, the charitable system, it wasn't really that charitable, but that idea that the child welfare system comes out of this progressive view to provide charity to children. All of that, though, was directed at impoverished white children. So the real origins, including the slavery system, but for white people, it was the Elizabethan Poor Laws, and the idea that poverty is the fault of impoverished people, and they should be blamed for their poverty and punished for it. And so that notion that came to the colonies, that there was a system for poor families that was different from the system for wealthy families. Landowners didn't have to worry about being sent to the poorhouse. And then even when you get reforms like foster care, it's still designed for poor families. So from the very beginning, the child welfare system has never been a system of caring for affluent or even middle class and wealthy families. It's not a system for the ruling class because it's a punitive system. It's the ruling class putting this system, this punitive, oppressive, disruptive, terrorizing system as a way of dealing with the needs of impoverished children. And so there's just that fact that it's tied to poverty in the sense that it is a system to deal with impoverished families. So that's the foundation of it. Then there's the way in which it operates to pretend that the reason why impoverished children have unmet needs is because their parents have deficiencies. Their parents don't know how to take care of them. Their parents are pathological. And so it blames parents for the harms to children. The US has a huge childhood poverty rate, the highest among Western nations. And it's not because they have bad parents, it's because we have a society structured to put people in poverty and to make it very difficult to escape poverty. And so we have an extremely unequal society. And this system operates in a way to blame the parents for it, diverting attention from those structures. So that's another way in which it's connected. Now, there's a practical way in which it's connected as well, which is to define child neglect as poverty.
Exactly.
What is child neglect? Child neglect is parents or other family caretakers failing to meet the needs of children, failing to provide adequate clothing, food, shelter, education, medical care. That's what child neglect is. And I mean, it's literally defined that way in most state statutes. So what is that? It's identifying the experiences of impoverished children. And so child neglect is literally defined and equated with poverty. And that's how it is that those children are the ones whose families are investigated. They're the ones who get taken from their families. I mean, a simple example is if a caseworker finds a family, or if the family's reported to be living on the street because they don't have shelter, the response is to take the child away and put the child in foster care because the child is being neglected. The child doesn't have adequate clothing, adequate food, is missing school, doesn't have adequate health care. All of those things are deemed to be neglect, and most of the children who are taken and put in foster care are taken on grounds of neglect. Only about 16% of children in foster care are there because of allegations of physical or sexual abuse. So there's that. But I also want to make the point that poverty is also an enhancement of parental culpability, because there are things that wealthy parents do that don't get them on the radar of the child welfare system. You know, I can't tell you how many memoirs, I happen to be reading memoirs lately, and there's so many memoirs of wealthy white children who write about how horrible their childhoods were, how neglectful their parents were, or abusive their parents were, the eating disorders they had, the other mental health problems they had, that never, there was no idea that the child welfare system would interfere in their lives. And that's because it's not designed for them. They have professionals that they go to. They have drug treatment programs they go to, the children and their parents. They have counselors, professional therapists, all other kinds of private services. And those people are mandated reporters, but they don't report them to CPS. They just take care of their problems. The very same behaviors, a parent who has a substance abuse problem, or a child who has a mental health problem that the parent is having trouble dealing with, that will get that child removed. If they're an impoverished family or a low-income family. Even things like a child straying away. You know, I start Torn Apart with the story of Vanessa Peoples, who gets charged with child abuse because her toddler strayed away for a minute from a park, a picnic in a park. Any parent knows how easy it is for your toddler to stray away from you. And that isn't seen in a wealthy neighborhood as child neglect or child abuse, but it is seen as child abuse or neglect in impoverished neighborhoods. Now, part of it might be because the reporters think that it's more dangerous for children in impoverished neighborhoods. If that's the case, it's still targeting them unjustly, but I also think that there is this idea that is both a mixture of class prejudice and racial prejudice, and also prejudice against people with disabilities, often combined, that sees parents in those communities or with those statuses as being less capable. And there's a way in which the system finds it easier to take their children away than to take away the children of wealthier families. So for all, in all those ways, poverty and discrimination against people who are impoverished and the urge to punish them, for the government to punish them and blame them for their poverty is deeply, deeply embedded in the child welfare system. There is no such thing
Right.
as a child welfare system without punishment of poor people.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the overrepresentation, the significant involvement or interference in the lives of Black families by the system. One of the things that you wrote in Shattered Bonds, again, 22 years ago?
Yeah,
21.
21. Yeah.
That was profound to me. I remember at the time you wrote, "The color of America's child welfare system is the reason Americans have tolerated its destructiveness." To me, that is such a profound statement of the problem of anti-blackness
Yeah.
in society.
Yeah.
That we are willing to look the other way because this is only happening to Black kids.
Yeah.
Talk more about that. How did we get to that place?
Yeah. Well, I think that explains so much about why the United States is such a wealthy nation with so many problems, so many people who are houseless, so many people who don't have adequate health care, education. Why is that? And I know there have been lots of explanations for it, but I think the primary explanation is white supremacy and racism, that a majority of white people in America are invested in their superior social and political position. And this is this is a fact that they have opposed policies that would provide a healthier, more supportive society for everybody. So they would rather live in a society that's harmful to them than have a society that benefits Black people. And so that is related to the way in which if a system can be seen as involving Black people, it's easy for the power structure in America to allow it to fester. This is partly related to residential segregation, which is related to the child welfare system, as I write in the book. In big cities, child welfare authorities concentrate their efforts in segregated Black neighborhoods. I don't know about Houston. I wouldn't be surprised, though. I know that's true in Chicago, in New York, in San Francisco. It's really very glaring. And so that the impact on Black children and families is so much more intense than what's experienced in any other neighborhood in the city. The only other comparison would be on Indian reservations, where there's intense child welfare agency involvement as well. So then, like so many things, but we'll focus on the child welfare system, but so many of the harmful aspects of inequality that are borne the most by Black Americans can then be ignored because they're not affecting the majority of white people. There are very few areas of America that would have the kind of intense disruption by Child Protective Services that Black neighborhoods have. But that's true for so many aspects of America where it's concentrated in Black neighborhoods. And so it's easy for a majority of white Americans to ignore it. Also, this comes along with stereotypes, negative stereotypes, deeply embedded negative stereotypes about Black people that make it easy to blame us for these bad outcomes. And so it's possible then for those who promote family policing to say, well, we have to go in their neighborhoods and save the children from the dangers of their neighborhoods, from their incompetent parents, from their dysfunctional families. And that's why we need the child welfare system. And that is supported by the people who are saying that not having to experience the terror of the system and also supported by these deeply embedded stereotypes that have been circulating in US culture for 400 years. The one that I focus on in my work, also in my book, Killing the Black Body, is the idea that Black mothers pass down negative, dysfunctional, terrible lifestyles to their children. That Black mothers are incapable of raising law-abiding children, are incapable of raising children who are going to earn a living and be upstanding citizens, that we pass down these negative behaviors to our children. And this is reinforced by the image of the Black welfare queen, the image of the Black crack addict, even the image of the mammy who took care of white children but was supposed to be neglectful toward her own. She wasn't taking care of her own children, right? And she had to be under the supervision of the white mistress. So these are long-standing stereotypes that have been perpetuated generation after generation. And I deeply believe that the family policing system continues to operate because there's this idea that Black families don't have deeply loving bonds. And so the trauma of taking a Black child from their parents is just lost on so many people. I've been at so many forums and meetings and conferences where the notion that you are harming a child by stripping them away from their loving parents, it's not mentioned at all. It's assumed that Black children must be better off. If they're taken from their families, they must be better off. Even the idea that we know the damage of foster care, and yet there's the idea that, but still, they must be better off than if they stayed at home in their dangerous families and neighborhoods. So I think that those stereotypes really help to maintain this system, along with the way in which our nation is still so racially segregated and so divided racially in so many ways.
I want to move to talk about abolition now.
Oh, yes, and you did ask me about the $30 billion. Yes.
So let me get to that.
Yes, okay. I'll tell you what I think that should go.
the very next sentence, back in Shattered Bonds, when you talked about the color of the child welfare system, you also said that's also the most powerful reason to finally abolish what we now call child protection and replace it with a system that really promotes children's welfare. When you wrote Torn Apart, you renewed your call for abolition, but you changed your ideas a bit about what abolition means. One of the things that when Ruth Wilson Gilmore was here a couple of years ago, she described abolition as being a way of seeing. She said that abolition forces you to look at a system and ask yourself, what am I seeing and what would I rather see? When you look at the family policing system and what led you to change your views about abolition from Shattered Bonds to Torn Apart, what would you rather see?
Well, let me say that part of what led me to change my views, and I did believe when I wrote Shattered Bonds, so first of all, I immediately, as soon as I began to look into the child welfare system, I thought it was a racist system because it was so obvious that, in Chicago, all the children taken from their homes were Black children, virtually every single one of them. I'm not exaggerating, it was more than 90%. And you could see going to court that you just saw Black families coming in and Black mothers crying, because their children were taken from them. And it was obvious to me, this is a system for Black families. When in America does the government provide a helpful system to Black families? That seemed obvious that there's something wrong with it. So, and I quickly began to learn the harms of it and thought that we needed to end it. But what changed was that I realized that after working on trying to reform it, lots of different reforms, to reduce the foster care population and reduce the disproportionality, and reduce the harms, I realized that you can't reform this system. It has to just be abolished because it is designed to oppress people. So, you try to fix it, you just make it more efficient at oppressing people, or mask the oppression, make it, legitimize it. And so I realized that I should be working to demolish it and replace it. So now we get to the questions. So one thing I would do is take that $30+ billion and give it to families to help take care of their children. I have no doubt whatsoever that if that money were handed out in checks to the families that need it the most, that children would be better off than what we have now. Absolutely, because that $30 billion, most of it is going to maintaining children away from their families. And we have mounds and mounds and mounds of evidence that foster care is harmful to children. So that's one thing. But I think we need to do more. We need to imagine that children would not have unmet needs. They have unmet needs not because their parents are pathological. They have unmet needs because our society is structured in a way that makes it impossible for many parents to meet their children's needs. So I would want a society that provides ways, and this is on multiple levels. I mean, it means giving concrete resources to families on a voluntary basis, for them to decide how to use them without having to go through all these hoops and mandates and family training, parental training classes, and all of this, the threats that they'll take their children away or actually taking children away, all these coercive means provide the resources that families need. And that can be done, I think, partly by government spending, but also I think it has to be community-based, and it has to be in a voluntary, caring manner, and not the way in which so-called services are performed now. And we also have to restructure the systems and institutions that we have that create childhood poverty and that punish people for human needs. And so that means housing, that means childcare, that means healthcare, education. All of this should be structured in a more equitable way so that people can have all of these needs met in a society that is humane and more equal than we have now. And there's lots of ways to do that. There are many people working toward that, but this is important. I think that you can't do that while you're punishing people. That's. I think some people look at abolition and they say, okay, well, we can't abolish this. We need this system to keep children safe. So we'll work on these other things while we continue the system. But this system is an impediment to providing a humane, creating a humane society. It's an impediment to it because it promotes this idea that children's unmet needs are the fault of their parents, and it deters people from seeking services that would help them and their families, and it turns a whole cadre of professionals who could provide help to families into reporters for this punitive system. As I said before, we have a whole group of professionals and programs and services for wealthy people, that aren't punitive. So we know that can happen. Right. It's just that for people who can't afford them, instead, there's a punitive system for them. Exactly. And one way of looking at it is provide the same kinds of services and programs and professional care that wealthy people get to everybody.
Absolutely. Right. We're going to save some time for audience questions tonight, but I have 3 more questions I want to get through. That are really good questions that I really want to ask.
Okay.
Dr. Aaron Dunn, who is a social and psychiatric epidemiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital's Center for Genomic Medicine, said, "The scientific evidence against separating children from families is crystal clear. No one in the scientific community would dispute it. It's not like other topics where there's more debate among scientists. We all know it is bad for children to be separated from caregivers. Given the scientific evidence, it is malicious and amounts to child abuse." Then Dr. Charles Nelson, a pediatrics professor at Harvard Medical School, said, "There's so much research on this, separating children from their parents, that if people paid attention at all to the science, they would never do this." Now, of course, they weren't talking about children who were separated by the family policing system.
Right.
They were talking about children who were separated at the border during the Trump administration.
Yes.
There seems to me this huge cognitive dissonance between what happened at the border when people were rightfully outraged and the fact that this is happening daily all around us. You write in Torn Apart, local CPS agents take as many children from their parents every week as were separated under the entire Trump zero tolerance policy. How do we get past that disconnect?
Well, see, that disconnect is an example of what I was saying about racism and white supremacy, because how is it that that same knowledge about the harm to children isn't applied to the separation of Black children from their families? So, racism is so deep because it has created this way of thinking that Black people especially, it applies to others as well. There are lots of different racialized populations, but for Black people in particular, there's this idea that we are a different kind of human being, if not less than human. And it's interesting you mentioned the scientist, because there's still, this is the subject of my book, Fatal Invention, there's still this idea that Black people are biologically different. And it's interesting how, I'm trying not to go off on a tangent here, but it's interesting how you see these ideas about how during the so-called crack epidemic, for example, that Black mothers were deprived of maternal instinct, because they smoked crack. This biological idea that Black babies who were exposed to crack cocaine in utero were monsters, that they were different from any other babies. There's still this idea that Black people pass down one way or the other some kind of depraved, traits to their children, and that we don't have normal, loving relationships with each other. And so, it is possible to see, again, I have to go off on this because it's so important to see, how was it that Thomas Jefferson, I know you didn't expect me to talk about Thomas Jefferson, but how could Thomas Jefferson say that we're creating a nation, grounded in equality and freedom and liberty for all. All men are created equal. They have the inalienable right, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while he's enslaving his own children. How could he do that? Because he didn't see them as human beings. He didn't see them as all these principles applying to them. And so, yes, people can read the scientific evidence of the harm of family separation, but they don't think it applies to Black people. Right. I mean, that's the truth. They don't think it applies to us. So how do we get around that? It's a deep nut to crack, as I say. I mean, it's really hard, but I do think we have to grapple with this. That's what we have to be honest. This is a racist, white supremacist system. it is fueled by and grounded in these deep racist ideas. Anti-blackness is at the heart of it. And if we don't grapple with that, we'll never get around it, because people will read the scientific evidence and they'll continue to think that Black children need to be saved from their deficient parents. So we have to deal with the very thinking around racism. And part of the reason I wrote this book is to shed a light on it, to force people to look at what this is. I think that's the first step, is to say, let's be honest about this. How do you reconcile these contradictions if it's not white supremacy and racism? And I think that there are people who will listen and whose eyes are open and who I think you're one of them, Alan. You said in your introduction that you realize that working for this system was harmful, and you changed your views. And there are people who will change their views if they're, really forced to confront them. Not everybody, but I have to believe enough will to join the movement to abolish the system. And we may not see it, in our lifetimes. Well, I'm older than you, and maybe you will, but and maybe your students will. But we have to work toward ending it and replacing it with a truly humane and equitable society and ways of truly caring for children and supporting families.
Right. I want to ask you about one other area where there's disconnect, and something that you uniquely have an expertise in both areas, and that's the relationship between abolition of family policing and reproductive justice. Many people now are, again, rightfully outraged about the assault on reproductive rights. And there are connections between the fight to abolish family policing and the fight for reproductive justice. Can you explain those connections?
Sure. Oh, there's another. You asked me these questions, and 100 thoughts pop into my head, and I try.
Great. In 2 minutes.
I'm going to try. Okay. I'm going to try. So first of all, reproductive justice is a framework and a struggle for true reproductive freedom over our reproductive bodies and our reproductive lives, that includes not only the right to not have a child, which is being eviscerated around the country now, but also includes the right to have a child and to raise your child in a supportive, nurturing environment, i.e. not to have the government come and take your child away from you because of racist and anti-poverty notions about child welfare. So reproductive justice encompasses opposing the family policing system. Now, also, notice that some of the ways in which advocates who want to support bans on abortion are recommending adoption as a solution. In fact, Justice Amy Coney Barrett suggested it during the Dobbs argument, and Justice Alito has a line and footnote in the Dobbs majority opinion reiterating this argument, and also the footnote saying that basically there's a big demand for adopted children and the supply is too low. And so these two issues have been brought together in these arguments that we need to compel people to give birth so that they can supply their babies for adoption. Now, that isn't going to happen because most people, even if they wanted to get an abortion and can't, they keep the child. And also, if children are placed up for adoption, left at these the safe havens, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be, the parents won't be investigated. And also, those children who now are being raised in struggling families where they made a decision, we can't afford another child, but are forced to have a baby, they're going to be struggling even more. So more at risk of having their children taken away. So I believe, I'm pretty sure that the bans on abortion and forcing people to give birth are going to increase the numbers of children who are taken forcibly from families, put more families under the radar of family policing, and that brings those two issues together as well. And Black women are going to bear the brunt of all of this because Black women are more likely to seek abortion because of unintended pregnancies. That is due to poverty, lack of adequate sex education, other kinds of needs, and they also are the most likely to have their children taken from them. So most likely to also to die from pregnancy-related causes. And we also have to understand that these laws are going to increase maternal mortality because it means that people are getting inadequate reproductive health care, and it's also forcing doctors to, in complicated pregnancies, not perform abortions that would save the life of mothers until they're sure, many of them, that they won't be prosecuted for it. Right. And that also puts pregnant people at risk. Mm-hmm. So for all those reasons, these issues are deeply entangled, and they are all issues of reproductive justice.
Right. Okay, last question before we get to some audience questions.
Okay.
And this is one specific to social workers in the room and social workers watching online. In 2021, the NASW, National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, added a statement that said social workers must take action. And this is the only place in the whole Code of Ethics that uses the word must. Social workers must take action against racism, discrimination, oppression, and inequities. Simultaneously, the position of the National Association of Social Workers is that 100% of the family policing workforce should be social workers. They believe that everyone working in the child welfare system should minimally have an undergraduate degree.
Okay,
in my mind, those two positions can't exist at the same time. What are we going to do about social work? What would you want to say to social workers and these incredibly conflicting positions?
That's so interesting. So I can only imagine that, I mean, I endorse the first position, obviously. The second position, I think, is probably geared at improving child welfare decision-making because currently it's pretty easy to become a caseworker. And in fact, it's kind of shocking how easy it is. And so you have people who aren't really trained in social work, very inexperienced people who are going in and making decisions, these life-changing decisions for families, and including the decision to take children away from their families and put them in foster care, with sometimes rubber stamped by judges, right? So, and that's really bad too. Okay, so I can imagine they're thinking, well, it'll be improved if we train them better. And so this is the idea that you solve the problems of a system that is designed to oppress people by training the people who do the oppression better.
But should social workers be working in a system?
So I'm actually pointing out the contradiction. Yes, in those statements. I think it's a complex question, but my position is that no one should be working in this system, and in fact, social workers in particular should not be, because they have this code of ethics, which should tell them that they shouldn't be working for a system that is designed and aimed at furthering racial oppression. So I agree, it's contradictory, and I don't think that social workers should be working in the system. Again, I believe we should be doing everything we can to reduce the power of this system toward completely dismantling it. And just to say, I started out by saying what I thought the idea behind saying they should all be social workers is. I mean, I can imagine it is an idea about reform. It's an idea about improving the skills, improve decision making, and that is an example of how reforms can work to strengthen a system, make it more efficient in doing the harm that it does, and so. I think that also means we need to radically rethink what social work is. It's not. And that's why I think it's so great that you're the dean of this College of Social Work. And it's such a powerful thing to have a leader of an institution that is training people to become abolitionists and to rethink what social work even means. It's a big project, but it's just an example of the kind of really expansive rethinking we have to do in every single aspect of this field.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
And now I think we have some time for some audience questions. Whether in this audience or in our live audience, I think there's some microphones on the side of the room. There are.
Oh, wow, you're gonna be in the spotlight. Now they might say, I don't want to ask, I'm on the spotlight.
Here come some people.
Okay. Okay.
I always have a question. As someone who grew up in foster care and kinship placements, I never met anybody who was in foster care because they were neglected. I only met people who were in foster care because they were abused, like I was. My question comes as someone who came from an impoverished Black neighborhood. One side of my street was Jennings, which is also kind of Ferguson, where Michael Brown was killed. The other side was St. Louis City. And you could tell the difference because one side had a sidewalk and the other one didn't. And so up the street from me was a woman who had 7 children, and they never had anything. It was a true case of neglect because this was during the crack epidemic, and she was on drugs and prostituting herself, and often prostituting the children as well. She was reported so many times, and her children were deemed unworthy of state resources. My mother, before her rights were terminated, had been reported 26 times by mandated reporters. And we weren't taken until I was 15. My sister was eventually kicked out of foster care because she was too hard to manage as a person with borderline personality disorder. My question is about the people who are ignored by the system, who are deemed the unworthy poor, and how can we help them? Because we know in a capitalist society, there are groups of people that oppress and groups of people that are oppressed, but then there are also people who are excluded from the system altogether. And so how do we help those people who are altogether excluded from the system?
Yeah. Thanks for your question. I'm really glad you asked it because I don't want to leave the impression that abolition means ignoring people, abandoning people, just leaving things the way they are. And also, I don't want to leave the impression that just because most of the children who are put in foster care are there because of neglect, there aren't children who are there for physical and sexual abuse. As I said, nationally, the federal government statistics show that the vast majority are in foster care because of neglect. As I said, it's about 16 or 17% there for physical and sexual abuse. But of course, those are important cases as well, important children. But what I'm saying is that even what you described is a system that misses children who need help, misses families who need help. In fact, most of the struggling families in America, most of the unmet needs of children who are, you could say, fall under the definition of neglect, who don't have their needs met, don't have adequate food or shelter or clothing or education or health care. The vast majority of them are not addressed by the child welfare system at all. They're completely ignored by it. And of course, there are many, many children who are physically and sexually abused who don't get in the system either. And most of the time when we hear about the child welfare system in the papers, it's because a child was killed at home, and they say, oh, known to the system. And then people say, oh, well, we need more of this system. Well, it's a system that was unable to protect the child. So, yes, you're right that this system harms people who are brought into it, and it also misses the majority of children and families who need help. But then we need a different way. This isn't to say, let's just allow child abuse and neglect to go on. Let's allow children to go without needs. Let's allow violence to continue in families. Let's allow unmet substance use disorders to flourish. No, it's let's figure out a better way of actually addressing the human needs that people have, which are not mostly caused by some kind of pathology in people. They are caused by structural inequities. Even as it's interesting. Even as you talk about what happened in your family, you also mention the inequalities in the neighborhood. So this is why I think it's important to think about the violence and the mental health problems and the conflicts that go on in wealthier families that aren't dealt with by taking their children away. There are ways, and I'm not saying that those ways are the best, but I'm just saying we know that there are ways of dealing with problems that families have without taking children away. And there are also people who are working on transformative justice approaches, non-carceral approaches to violence in families that are working on dealing with substance use disorders that do occur. Although I have to say a lot of children are also removed because parents are using drugs where the children haven't been harmed. So I'm not saying that drug use by itself constitutes child abuse and neglect. It doesn't. But yes, there are families that are struggling with substance use problems, and those problems are not being addressed. So again, I'm glad you raised this issue of the families that are excluded, but the child welfare system, this is why I'm saying we have to abolish it, because it stands there as a substitute for really addressing the unmet needs of children and families. It says, oh, we're dealing with it because we have child protective services. And the answer is to give more money to child protective services instead of recognizing it has failed to protect children, because that's not what it was ever designed to do. We have to imagine other ways. And I think one of the ways of doing it is to listen to people who've experienced abuse in their homes or unmet needs in their homes. What could be done that would be a better way of addressing it? What could be done? You know, I think probably we could have a long conversation, and this is not, you know, this is too tight a period to do it. We could, you and many others could come together and say, what would be a way that would have addressed the harms that you experienced as a child? What could we do to avoid it altogether? What could have been done in your neighborhood? How could people in your neighborhood have come together? How could they have been supported so that those harms didn't occur? But clearly, I think you actually support the idea that this system doesn't work. And I hope that I have supported the idea that it doesn't work, because it doesn't work to truly keep children safe and improve their welfare, because that's not what it was designed to do. And it never will be until, you know, it never will. We need something radically different.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Why don't we go to this side?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So my question was about social work. So even if you're not directly working for CPS, you still have that mandated reporting thing that you have to do. So like, I'm at a clinic right now, and we do a lot of like, you know, you're working with medically complex kids.
Yeah.
And we have to do a lot where the doctors or the other social workers call CPS.
Right.
So even if you're not directly working for CPS, we're still like, you know, contributing to kids being involved in CPS. So
Yeah.
with the idea of abolition and things like that, I guess, what does it look like today to try to separate yourself from CPS when we're all like mandated reporters?
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing is to work to abolish mandated reporting, to get mandated reporting rules repealed. So, you know, so mandated reporting is part of why I say we have to abolish this system, because it turns people like social workers like you who want to assist and support families into reporters to a system that you know is harming families. And so there are people who are working to end mandated reporting for that reason. So that's one thing we can do to, you know, work toward that. The other is to to do what you can, that you know you can, to support the person who you would report instead of reporting them. You know, people will say, "Oh, but now you're breaking the law. You're violating your ethics." Again, there are so many middle class and affluent families that have the same problems, and they don't get reported. We know that. We know, for example, that drug use while pregnant, that it is much more likely that if you are, first of all, if you're Black, you're going to get reported more likely than if you're white. But also, if you're impoverished and Black, you're much more likely. Wealthy, doctors who have wealthy patients do not report them for drug use. Not at the same rates. I mean, there's studies that show this. So mandated reporting is a matter of interpretation. I mean, am I right? Isn't that true? Let's be honest. The people, It's a matter of interpretation. And so why can't professionals who are so-called mandated reporters use their professional judgment? That's what you were trained to do. That's, this is the irony of it. You're a mandated reporter because you're a professional who's supposed to be able to address these issues that come up. And instead of doing that, you report people to a system that you know is not going to do what you could have done. So I think we have to be willing to provide the support that you were trained to do, rather than continue to report to a system that harms people. And, I'll just say, use your professional judgment in the same way that those people supporting wealthy people use their judgment to decide, I'm not going to report this child or this parent. I'm going to help them with their, whatever problem they have. Also, let me also say, this has to be a collective effort. Like, it's hard to do these things if you're by yourself, hanging out there on your own. It has to be a collective effort. Thanks for your question. I mean, these aren't easy. None of this is easy. But, this is a system that is rooted in 400 plus years of oppression and an ideology of punishing the most vulnerable, disenfranchised people. It's hard to challenge it and demolish it. But again, we have to do it together and collectively. The only way that we'll be able to make a dent and eventually replace that entirely.
And it's possible.
It is possible. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely possible.
Want to go over here?
I was trying to flip students over, but.
Okay.
Hi, good evening, Dean Dettlaff, and good evening, Dr. Roberts. Thank you so much for these radical conversations, and I know they're extremely challenging and just very radical, but I think it's necessary to have this type of conversations. My question is mainly for Dean Dettlaff. I know you and I have had this conversation in the past. I'm also I'm
not part of the Q&A.
I'm an alumni also of the GCSW, so I am proud to be an alumni of the program. But I have a particular question and more of a follow-up because you and I have had this conversation. But the GCSW currently has a child welfare education project stipends, which provides full stipend for full-time students and part-time students, and it is focused to prepare master's level of social work students for challenging and rewarding work in children's protective services, so in the child protective services. So with that being said, as you all continue to work in this very critical work, how is the GCSW challenging itself and its programs and its stipends, and ensure that programs like this one is not encouraging more students to go into the child protective service?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
They like that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that, obviously I think about all the time. I mean, I'm very aware that I'm dean of a College of Social Work with a child welfare education training program while also working to abolish the child welfare system. That program has existed for a very long time, and I think those programs exist in about 400 schools in the United States, state schools. And if you're not familiar with what those are, these are schools where the federal government pays stipends, either in the form of direct tuition assistance or living expenses, for people who either work in the family policing system or agree to go work in the family policing system. And then there's like a payback period. So you get your education for free, and then you have to go work in that system for several years. I would like to see all of those systems ended. particularly in social work schools. I have the same position as Dorothy. I don't think social workers should be working in any capacity in the family policing system or in any carceral system with the police or with prisons or in any of those aspects. Our child welfare education program is a project that's led by one of our faculty members. And because that's led by one of our faculty members, there are issues of academic freedom that prevent me from saying what our faculty can and can't do. What I would like to do is advocate for those programs to be eliminated entirely at the federal government level, because I don't think that it's another form of enslavement in many ways. We're essentially paying for people's education and then bribing them to go work for a system that in many cases they don't want to work for to begin with, but it's the only way for them to afford their education. Another thing that we could do is make college free, which is what it should be, and then we shouldn't have. If we didn't have to pay for an education, then we wouldn't have to rely on government programs like this that force people to go work for a harmful system in exchange for an education. So I think the bigger answer is to get rid of those programs entirely.
Thank you.
You know, that question wasn't for me, but I have.
Go ahead.
Well, it just reminds me of what happens. It's not exactly the same, but in legal education, most students, I know graduating from the law school where I teach at University of Pennsylvania, go into corporate law jobs that pay a lot of money. And it's very hard for our students who want to go into public interest work to resist that because they have law school loans and college loans to pay off, and the salaries are often very low for public interest work, especially compared to corporate law jobs. And so we have various ways of raising money for fellowships, so for public interest students, including money that was given by donors, but also we have an auction every year to raise money. And so finding alternative ways of raising money for students to avoid being able to resist, that bribe is really important too.
Yeah. Thanks.
So I want to thank you, Dean, for inviting Professor Roberts here. I'd love to have you at the law school too. But I have a question for you that does have to do with law school, so
Okay.
it kind of fits with here and working collaboratively. So what do you tell law students that want to go into public interest law, represent children in the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system, both of which are extremely racist,
Yeah.
both of which do harm to Black and brown children across this country at much greater numbers than any other group of children?
Yeah.
And you're telling social work students, hey, we gotta destroy this system and abolish it, don't go into it. But what about the lawyers? What do we tell our law students to do
Yeah.
to both help change this system, abolish the system, but still do something with their law degrees at the same time?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I say go into family defense practice, which I see, so, you could say family defenders, these are usually units of legal services offices that are dedicated to representing parents and other family caregivers who've been accused of abuse or neglect. And they see themselves as representing the family. They don't see this as parents against children, but they are aimed at keeping the family together. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, they're still part of the system because, they're part of this broader legal apparatus. But I do see their work as different because they are working to keep families together. And very often now they're multidisciplinary, many of them have social workers. So that's one place where social workers can go, and I would encourage social workers to go work with family defenders. Many of them have also peer advocates of parents who have been impacted by family policing. And community legal services in Philadelphia is an example of that. Many of them are advocates. They're the ones in New York, like the Bronx and Brooklyn Defenders and Harlem Community Legal Services. They're all working, with Joyce McMillan and at JMAC for Families, and working toward abolishing the system. And I see that as part of the kinds of non-reformist reforms, to borrow Ruth Gilmore's term, where we have to incrementally work toward dismantling the system and replacing it with reforms that aren't aimed at strengthening the system or legitimizing it, but reforms that are aimed at reducing the power of the system as we work to abolish it. So the vision is toward abolition, but there are ways like passing legislation to give parents, well, they should have they have constitutional rights, I should say, to actually guarantee and apply the Constitution in investigations, or to end mandated reporting. To give parents Miranda rights. So all of these are still part of the broader apparatus of family policing, but they're aimed at shrinking it. And I would make that distinction. So I think it's different to be a family defender, keeping families out of the system, than being a social worker within the system, where you are forced to apply the thinking of the system and the rules of the system.
Yeah, I think one of the problems for our students is that most of them want to stay in Texas, and then it's all court-appointed positions, which makes it very different. But I would also urge social work students to please work with our law students and lawyers to make things better. I always stress that holistic approach, and we need you social workers to help with that. And think about working with small firms and or public defender offices.
Yes, yeah, great idea.
Okay, we're already over time, so we're going to take one more question over here, and then Dr. Roberts will be available afterwards at a book signing if you have questions there too. So let's do one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thank you so much for taking my question. You had mentioned when talking about reproductive justice that Black women have a higher rate of maternal mortality.
Yes.
43 per 100,000 as compared to the national average of 17, so more than double.
Yes.
And 17's not good
No.
for a developed
No,
nation.
yes,
That put
the
us
US is
between, I
bad.
believe, Ukraine and Russia before, like in 2020.
Right.
And so amongst Black women, it is the same as in Samoa, Algeria, and Vietnam.
Yeah.
Around 90th from the top. I'm hoping to work in public health, mostly on definancialization of healthcare, to put it one way. And so if I'm successful in my work and we fully remove like the financial barrier to healthcare, what other steps would be needed to bring down particularly the Black maternal death rate?
Yeah. So, yes, so I do believe that universal free healthcare for everybody would significantly improve the health of this nation, especially of those people who currently have the worst healthcare, the least access to it. But it's not only lack of access to healthcare that drives the huge gap in maternal mortality, and also in the United States, as you're pointing out, our maternal mortality rate is going up. It's just a travesty, maternal mortality in the United States. And for Black women, it's way off the charts compared to many developing nations. It's safer for a Black woman to be pregnant in Kenya and Rwanda than in this part of the country, in the south of the United States. So it's not just because of lack of access to healthcare, although again, I want to stress, I think that's really, really important. But also, Black women have reported being treated poorly when they are in the hospital for labor and delivery. Even Serena Williams, who had excellent access to healthcare. So there is rampant racism in medical practice in the United States. I mentioned earlier some of these ideas of Black biological difference. A study in 2016 found that medical students and residents at a major medical school believe things like Black people have thicker skin than white people, and Black people have less sense of nerve endings, so don't feel pain. Okay, so these, in 2016, this study was published. These ideas that Black people don't feel pain, that we don't need care, are still circulating. So that's one thing that we have to get rid of. And part of that means that Black women should be attended to by Black midwives. That's what I believe. I mean, if I'm going to say we have to support community-based reproductive health care, which means midwives and doulas. I firmly believe that we would reduce drastically the maternal mortality rate. And then also the living conditions. Black people too often have to get emergency care because we are living in conditions that are harmful to our health. And so, that it's not that Black people don't have access to health care. That's the major problem. The major problem is that our society is structured in a way that Black neighborhoods are bombarded with unhealthy living conditions. And so one example of this is, there is a procedure that Black people get more than white people. It's amputation. That's where Black people get extra health care. We are at high risk of having our limbs amputated. But that's the only one. Everything else, all the other kinds of healthcare interventions, Black people are less likely to get. But this amputation is because of the unaddressed chronic health conditions that Black people are more likely to have. That's why Black people are more likely to die from COVID. It's not because we don't believe in healthcare, it's because we have a higher burden of unhealthy living conditions. And that's not because we're unhealthy people. It's because the neighborhoods Black people are more likely to live in have been disinvested. They are near toxic conditions like highways and toxic waste dumps and other kinds of unhealthy conditions. Black people are likely to work in under unhealthy conditions. And all of that contributes to higher rates of maternal mortality. So, there's a big task you have, and all of us have. All of this has to be addressed. And the 2, 3, in some places 4 times higher rate of maternal mortality and infant mortality too is just one of the just despicable signs of the deeply rooted structural racism in America. And to address it, we have to get at those roots. We have to get at all of what causes that and end it. We have to end it, and that's, that means abolition. Abolition should not be a scary word. Like you have to abolish slavery. You have to end it. It's liberation, it's reimagining, it's making our society better for everybody. And That's why I guess we're at the end. So so go out and be abolitionists. I know you probably have some words.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want to quickly let you know about 2 other events coming up this semester if you're interested in abolition. One, on October 17th and 18th, it's going to be the virtual convening of the Up In movement, featuring keynote presentations from Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba. And then right here on this stage on November 1st, the rescheduled event with Derica Purnell in conversation with Kiese Lehman. We'll be right here on November 1st. So I hope you'll join us for that. Share your thoughts. Use our hashtag. Our hashtag is Toward Liberation. And right now there is a book signing with Dr. Roberts in room 237 that will go through 8:30. And then lastly, just thank you, Dorothy,
Oh, sure.
for being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
It's such an honor for you to be here and such a privilege. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Woo! We did it.
We did it. Y'all know where we need to go? Okay. Dorothy, have you met Josie? Josie, the answer is our program director. Those are, she was going to use them. Correct.